Hello and welcome to Frost Over the World. Later in the programme, a party leader who's been banned from this weekend's election in Iraq. Iceland's referendum on repaying $5.1 billion. And hit playwright Lucy Prebble. But first, the book which has caused a political storm and considerable merriment here in the UK. Within the next 3 months, a general election is due. It comes against a backdrop which, on the face of it, could hardly be worse for Britain's Prime Minister Gordon Brown. A long recession, infighting in Mr. Brown's Labour Party, and a new book which reveals the Prime Minister as, to say the least, ill-tempered, difficult, even volcanic. Yet, extraordinary though it seems, Mr. Brown's party is actually going up in the opinion polls, or some of them, at the moment. Faced with the allegation that their Prime Minister is a bit of a bully, voters seem not really to mind. Now, why would that be? Well, I'm joined by the author of the book that they're all talking about, and his name is Andrew Rawnsley. Andrew, welcome.
Lovely to be here, David.
Great to have you with us. How do you think your next conversation will go with Gordon Brown after you've been saying all these things about him?
Well, he might want to throw the book at me, I suppose, but he's been so desperate. He's been so desperate to prove that he's a very even-tempered man after the revelations in the book, that he's not always, that I expect he would try actually and be very civilised. And people who are still talking to me from within Number 10 say the book's almost done them a favour and that he's been trying to be unusually smiley and nice and saying please and thank you to them all the time, because of course the problem for him with the revelations in my book about his volcanic outbursts of temper is that he had to prove the opposite, or try to.
Now it's been rumoured, shall we say, for months and months, but you've gone further really, and that's from thousands of interviews with people you said,
yes.
Some of whom are very close to the Prime Minister, but don't want to be named.
Yeah, well, the book's based on more than 500 witnesses, many of them eyewitnesses to the episodes I recount. They include the most senior civil servants, members of the cabinet, very senior Number 10 officials, and Gordon Brown's own staff, because they're the only people. I mean, it's, as you say, quite rightly, David, there have been lots of rumour and gossip about the Prime Minister's conduct behind the closed door of Number 10 over the years. But I was always very clear, a rumour is not the same as a fact, and it was only after I got multiple and very careful and trustworthy sourcing for the accounts in that book that they went into the book, which is why Number 10 is in the end failed in its attempts to deny the contents.
And just for our viewers, give us an example of the incident. Say, for instance, the Stuart Wood incident.
Well, there was one incident where Gordon Brown was in a particularly evil temper, and a man called Stuart Wood, who's a very admirable man and has served the Prime Minister for a very long time, one of his senior advisors on foreign affairs, tried to brief the Prime Minister on some European ambassadors he was meeting, and Gordon Brown, using very strong language, which I better not repeat, said, why do I effing have to meet these people, shoved him aside. I mean, another thing I uncovered, which I did think was a bit disturbing, was the levels of paranoia in the Prime Minister at times when he got unpopular and felt besieged. There's one occasion where his Deputy Chief of Staff comes to him with some very bad news, and the Prime Minister leaps across the room and grabs him by the lapels and says, "They're out to get me."
Really? Are there other leaders around the world that we don't know have tempers like this? Or
I think lots of leaders are probably very bad-tempered, and of course you weigh that up, because to be fair, some of the people who've been on the receiving end of these volcanic eruptions of Gordon Brown's temper have nevertheless served him for many years and carry on serving him because they think that's a price worth paying, because he's a leader with other qualities that they admire. I think it was more difficult for the more junior and official staff at Number 10, because his two predecessors as Prime Minister, Tony Blair and John Major, one Labour, one Conservative, both had pretty impeccable manners towards the junior staff. And I think the people who found it very difficult were people like secretaries and telephone operators, if they were on the receiving end of a blast from the Prime Minister, because they couldn't answer back.
No, and so in that circumstance, do you think that the catalogue here of incidents like this disqualifies him as a future Prime Minister? I mean, he's a current Prime Minister, but next time?
No, I think it's always very pompous for journalists to say somebody is fit or unfit to be Prime Minister. in the end, that's for voters to decide. Our duty as journalists is to lay out the character of our leaders and those who aspire to lead us, but it's always the voters who have to come to the verdict at the election, which, as you say, in Britain will be shortly going to the polls, and they will weigh that up with other things, you know, policies, values, and they'll compare Gordon Brown and what they do and don't like about him with his Conservative rival David Cameron.
And in terms of the title of the book, The End of the Party, and then in small type, The Rise and Fall of New Labour. Well, these latest polls that give him some encouragement mean it might be the rise again of New Labour.
Or the rise and fall and miraculous Lazarite-like recovery of New Labour. It might be, and I've said to people, if which still doesn't look very likely, but I mean, if somehow miraculously he wins the next election, I'll change the title, or maybe I'll have to put a question mark on the end of it. And you're quite right, recent polls have been tightening up. I mean, the broad consensus of the polls at the moment is to give the Conservatives a lead of between 5 and 7 points, which in the British system means you'd be looking at a Conservative government with a very, very small majority, or perhaps lacking a majority, and then you'd have what we call here a hung parliament.
Hung parliament, exactly, which, in fact, there have been indications in what's been happening to the pound that people are worried by the next government, one way or another, being a weak government.
Yes, I think this is panicking the markets, both the currency markets, as you say, and the bond markets. The fear that if no party emerges with a majority at all, there won't be a strong government, and not a government strong enough to implement the cuts to public spending that are going to be necessary to bring down the deficit. And this is difficult because there are other countries, like Germany, for instance, where they've got a long history of organising coalition governments, so markets remain fairly calm. Now, this hasn't happened in Britain for more than a quarter of a century, so it's understandable why markets are panicking a bit, and they're not getting a very clear signal from any of the politicians what would happen in that eventuality.
And in terms of our viewers around the more than 100 countries and so on, what differences will they see if there was a Conservative government in Britain? How would it affect Britain's policies towards them?
Well, the Conservatives probably wouldn't dramatically change policy in terms of the Afghan war. They've said, and the fight against Taliban in Afghanistan, they say they'll be as committed as Labour is to staying there, though they will have a tricky questions to answer because they've repeatedly accused current Labour government of under-resourcing the British war effort there. Where would they find the money to put more resources into it? In terms of Europe, I think you would see a Conservative government more hostile to Europe than the current Labour government. Really, most of the senior figures in the Conservative Party very sceptical about the European Union. And Conservatives have traditionally been close to the United States, believed in the transatlantic alliance, so you would expect that to continue. Not a great change there, probably.
And what about deficits? A lot of the world has got deficits, but Britain has got a large deficit. Will the same thing happen to it? Slow progress, whichever party's in power?
You're quite right to say we've now got the biggest peacetime deficit since 1945. And whoever wins the election, whether Conservative or Labour, they're going to have to tackle this. And I don't think people in Britain have yet got their heads around just how severe this spending squeeze is going to be. Both parties are committed to bringing it down. One would expect a Conservative government would probably act quicker to bring it down, more likely to, although they've been backing away a bit from saying that recently, partly because of this tightening in the polls you were referring to. I would say Conservative government will start cutting deeper and quicker, yes.
But both parties will manage to spend £25 on your book, we hope.
I hope so. Yes, I think they might learn some things. I hope other people will as well, David.
Great to have you with us.
Lovely to be here.
All the best, Andrew. Thank you. Our thanks to Andrew Rawnsley. In a moment, we'll be hearing about two critical votes that are happening this weekend. Quite a contrast, Iraq and Iceland.